Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. When 14-year-old George Stinney was executed via electric chair, he was too short for the chair, so he used his Bible as a booster seat. He was later found out to be innocent. In the 1600s, Athanasius Kircher invented a musical instrument made out of cats. He would place them in a row according to the tone of their voice, stretching their tails under a keyboard made out of sharp nails. Texas had absolutely no regulations on natural gas until 1937, when a school blew up, killing 295 students and teachers. No one was held responsible, and the event was so bad that even Hitler sent a letter of condolence.
There's a parasite called guinea worm that enters your leg through infected drinking water, and you won't even know that you have it until a year later when it comes out through blisters on your skin. And at this point, it's over 2 feet long. It's commonly believed that the chlorine in pools make our eyes red. However, it's actually chlorine mixing with urine that causes this to happen.
I was a soldier who cooked my girlfriend in our apartment above a voodoo shop, ate her, and then jumped to my death. The detectives would find her charred head in a pot. Her legs and feet were in pans. The rest of her body was in rubbish bags in the fridge apartment we had in New Orleans, Louisiana. In my 20s, I had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. You could say I was proud and bitter about the experience. Then in the middle of Hurricane Katrina, Addie had given me shelter. That's where we fell in love. Over time, my past would catch up to me and have caused me great depression. Addie had accused me of cheating on her, and I snapped. I strangled her out of rage and watched her life leave her eyes. I scared myself not by the action of calmly strangling the woman I'd loved for 1.5 years. I then dismembered her body and seasoned her pretty well. After I hid my deed, I walked over to the Omni Hotel and had one last drink before jumping off of a roof. The cops would find my suicide note in my pocket that led them to my girlfriend. The stove I used to cook and eat her is now on display at the Bloody Mary New Orleans Haunted Museum.
Here are some facts that you probably didn't know that one day could save your life. If your pupils don't dilate to the same size, there is a very real chance you have brain damage. A motorcycle helmet is stronger than a skull. Tea bags actually stop bleeding. They contain a chemical called tannic, which naturally clots your blood. If you're in the wilderness and desperately need water, you can take a plastic bag and hold it against the branch of a willow tree, and it will condensate drinkable water into the bag. Never put tools or heavy objects on the back seat or dash of your car. If you get into a crash, you might survive the collision, but these items could be the cause of your death. If you see vultures circling above you, chances are there's a predator nearby and it's about to make a kill. Grapefruits can actually mess with prescription medication, and the most common of these is birth control. So stay away, because trust me, you do not have the time for a grapefruit baby. If a canker sore in your mouth or tongue isn't going away after 2 weeks, you might want to get it checked out because it very well could be oral cancer.
The police mistakenly shot me. My name is Robert Dutson, and this is my tragic story. My life took a turn on April 5th, in the Fernington area of New Mexico, where I live with my wife and 3 children. That evening, the police were called for a domestic violence incident at a house located at 5308 Valivio Avenue. 3 officers were dispatched to the scene but mistakenly knocked on our door at 5305 instead of 5308. Despite their communication with headquarters to confirm the intervention address, they continued knocking on our door and even laughed about their mistake. Concerned for my safety, I opened the door with a firearm, and one of the officers fatally shot me, firing 8 times. Upon hearing gunshots, my wife rushed downstairs and also fired her weapon before realizing they were police officers. Thankfully, no one was injured. My daughter witnessed the whole ordeal and began crying. The local police chief acknowledges the gravity of this incident and extends apologies to my family, but the damage has already been done. Like 40% of American households, we own firearms for self-defense, as was the case that night. The reason why the officers went to the wrong address, despite having the correct information, and why they continued knocking on my door is currently under investigation.
This TikToker killed 6 people in a car crash, and the content that he posted online is what led up to this terrible accident. So this is Noah Gale, and he used to post videos on Instagram and TikTok of him speeding in his BMW M5. He started growing a following because he would always ask people to guess how fast he was speeding, and if you guessed correctly the speed that he was at, he would send you $25. So obviously this encouraged him to keep going faster and faster. And he usually posted these videos going straight down the highway as fast as he physically could go. But on January 27th, 2022, this speeding would end in a horrific car accident. On that day, Noah was out making some content for his TikTok and Instagram speeding, and at one point he hit the speed of 151 miles per hour. Now, he was going 151 miles per hour and he rear-ended a Nissan Rogue SUV, which was going only a quarter of his speed, which would be only around 45 miles an hour or so. This was a massive, massive crash, and in the ensuing crash, 6 individuals passed away. Now, 5 of the people in the Nissan Rogue died at the scene, and 1 person died later at the hospital. And shockingly and sadly, Noah only received minor injuries. He walked away from this crash practically unscathed. So this case has yet to receive a verdict. There's no real movement on it. I don't know when the trial is going to start because this happened pretty recently last year. But as we saw before in the case of Cameron Herron, things like this, accidents like this, usually come with hefty prison sentences. And with Cameron getting over 20 years, I have no idea how long Noah's going to be in prison, but he should have ample time to sit and think about the stupid, terrible thing that he did.
Warner Brothers hired me to go find the nun in a very haunted building. I got to check out this 500-year-old abandoned convent. Oh, and don't think I'm not taking you with me. In the 1950s, it was said that a demon haunted the walls of this building. Some swore it was the devil himself, but most people who saw it said that it took the form of a nun. This room had absolutely horrible energy, and I wouldn't go in it. I then found out that was the last place that the nun was ever seen. The craziest part is this is where The Nun 2 was actually filmed. They really filmed the movie in a haunted building. I watched the movie, and the whole time I was looking for ghosts in the background. Go see The Nun 2 in theaters this Friday, and let me know if you see any of the real demons in the movie.
This sick predator used TikTok as his personal hunting ground for months before he was finally caught. Meet Robert Morse. He's 36 years old, from England, and he is a hardcore pedophile. So on TikTok, before he was arrested, Robert's username was GoldenEye0073, a reference to James Bond. So while he was on TikTok, Robert pretended to be a 12-year-old child. He would then go online and seek out minors, message them, and the conversations always turned extremely dark and graphic. One victim, who was 10 years old, was messaged by Robert. She thought he was a fellow child like her. But when she was asked by Robert to remove her undergarments, she became concerned and reported this to her parents. He also tried to groom an 8-year-old child. Acting as the 12-year-old once again, he messaged this 8-year-old girl on TikTok, asked her what kind of underwear she was wearing, and when she responded Frozen-themed underwear, he said you should remove them. He also told the girl to go dare her young brother to expose his private parts on camera. Now, obviously, after finding this out, both of these girls' parents went to the police, but when the police raided Robert's home and seized his cell phone, they couldn't imagine what they were going to find. So on Robert's phone, they found over 200 images and videos depicting CP or CSAM. Now, 65 of those images and videos were in category C, 75 were in category B, meaning they weren't the worst of the worst, but 95 of those videos and images were in the worst category that the police used to classify this stuff. 95, and these images, according to the police, include child assault, if you know what I mean, that's being videotaped and photographed. So this dude was extremely sick in the head, and he was collecting this material, making a sick collection out of it. The detective working this investigation actually went on the record and said that the messages, videos, and photos found on Robert's device were the worst that they've seen in their 18-year-long career. Now, while I'm thankful that this dude got some sort of prison sentence, this is shocking. He's only going to be in prison for 4 years. And since this happened in June of 2022, that means at this point he's only going to be in there for 3 more years. Now, I don't think that that's long enough for somebody to be rehabilitated, if that's even possible. So I'm going to be very, very concerned when this guy is let back into the free world. I'm really worried about that. And I definitely think that he should have gotten a longer sentence.
This video has to be one of the most epic proof of ghosts that I've ever seen. Here in a minute, I'm going to tell you the story as I let the video play, but I promise you, you're going to want to watch this all the way to the end, all the way through, because it's actually revealed at the end what this whole plot twist is about. And I'll tell you kind of the story as I play the video. This welder, he's working a late night shift and he's there by himself. And the thing is, there's a security guard that's sitting in the security booth and he's watching this guy, and this guy is doing some weird stuff. He looks like he's looking over his shoulder, like he's looking at something or talking to something, like there's just something weird going on. And the security guard notices that. Well, eventually the security guard calls the man in, and then what they discover next is just mind-blowing. The security guard calls the guy into this room and he says, "Who are you out there talking to?" And the guy was like, "I'm talking to the worker that was supposed to be here tonight. He showed up automatically. I know he was supposed to be off tonight, but he was out there, and that's who I was talking to." And you can see this guy here, look, and he even reaches out and he shakes his hand. And he appears to be talking to something. You see this orb looking thing floating right there. Now, I don't know if that is actually maybe a glare or something and it's just a coincidence, or if that's actually an orb. But you let me know what you think in the comments. But one of the craziest things is what you figure out next. Because this guy says, "I know he was down there." This is what he tells the security guard. "I was talking to that man." See, and he's even shown shaking his hand. But the crazy thing is that right here, later on, it's found out that the man who he was talking to actually died that very night. If you have a scary story, I made an email address right here that you guys can send me your stories. Just let me know if you want to remain anonymous or you want to be credited for that story. And I'm going to start telling you guys scary, bizarre, crazy stories. And it's going to be a whole series. So here's the email. Send them to me if you want to. And then let me know how you want to be presented, anonymous or not. Peace!
This woman is every parent's worst nightmare. This is the case of the babysitter from hell. It was February 1980 and the Johnson family needed a babysitter. They had a 2-year-old called Cassidy and set about looking for someone to take care of her. They'd previously used a woman called Christine Falling before, so reached out for her again to babysit. Now, on the night in question, when the Johnsons got home, Christine told them some terrible news. Cassidy had become unwell and fallen out of her cot. They rushed the child to hospital, but unfortunately Cassidy would tragically pass away. Her cause of death was ruled as encephalitis or brain inflammation. Now, 2 doctors had opposing opinions on the death. One said that they felt that it was a death of natural causes, but the second doctor passed on their suspicions to police. Police did interview Christine, but they found no evidence of foul play, so she was released. She ended up moving to Florida just weeks later. In May 1980, in Lakeland, Florida, emergency services received a call. A 4-year-old boy had stopped breathing. Tragically, paramedics were unable to save little Jeffrey Davis, who was being babysat by Christine. The death was listed as a result of a viral infection. 3 days later, 2-year-old Joseph Spring, the cousin of deceased little Jeffrey, was in need of a babysitter. His parents needed someone to look after him while they attended Jeffrey's funeral. In a shocking turn of events, Joseph passed away that day as a result of the same viral infection. The year after this, Christine moved to Perry. She ended up getting a job as a housekeeper for 77-year-old William Swindle. Now, on her first day on the job, she told emergency services that she found him collapsed and unresponsive on the kitchen floor. He was pronounced dead in hospital and an autopsy wasn't done. He was just believed to have simply died from a heart attack. By this point, Christine had experienced an awful lot of death in her various employments. A few weeks later, she ended up going to a vaccination appointment with her stepsister. Her stepsister's little girl was due to go and get her jabs. The appointment went absolutely fine, but then on the way back, they stopped at the shops to get some nappies, and Christine actually offered to stay in the car to watch the child while her stepsister hopped out. Shockingly, when she returned to the car, the little girl had stopped breathing. She was pronounced dead at the hospital and the death was thought to be a reaction to the vaccines. In June 1982, Christine was once again babysitting. This time it was for 9-week-old Travis Cook. As with most of the children in her care, Travis suddenly experienced respiratory distress. He ended up spending a week in hospital, but luckily survived and came home. However, Travis's parents, tragically completely unaware of Christine's role in their son's illness, asked Christine to babysit once again. When the parents returned home, this time, according to Christine, Travis had suddenly died. However, luckily an autopsy was done and showed that Travis died from suffocation. Immediately, Christine was arrested and began to admit to her crimes. Christine's upbringing was thought to be unstable. She was epileptic, she suffered from learning disabilities and also suffered with seizures. She would display fits of anger, and trigger warning here relating to animals. She had a fascination with torturing cats. She was apparently subjected to physical and abuse growing up. It's reported that while growing up she displayed symptoms of Munchausen syndrome, where someone will fake their own illnesses essentially. She claimed that she learned how to suffocate via the TV and claimed to have heard voices telling her to kill. In 1982, she got 2 life sentences. She later admitted to killing William Swindle too and was denied parole, and as far as I can see, she remains behind bars. This is the mystery of the honeymoon cruise disappearance. On June the 25th, 2005, George Smith married Jennifer Hagel in Newport, Massachusetts. To onlookers, the pair were a match made in heaven. Jennifer had just landed a great teaching job, and the pair were planning on going on a Mediterranean cruise to celebrate. However, it would be the last trip that the couple would ever go on. At the start of the cruise, they got quite friendly with the Askin family. The family consisted of a podiatrist and his wife and their 3 grown-up children. The oldest of the children was Josh Askin, and he was 20 years old and had smuggled some banned absinthe on board. Now, the ship headed to Mykonos on July the 4th, and after a great day, George and Jennifer went to a romantic meal on board. Then they did some gambling in the casino. Now, George and/or Jennifer were apparently heard bragging about having stacks of cash in their cabin. Witnesses recalled hearing them say that they had somewhere between about $15,000 to $20,000. It's not clear whether this was true or an exaggeration, but this was definitely the impression that people had on board. In the early hours of the 5th of July, the Smiths met 3 men. These were known as the Russians, who consisted of Gregory, Zachary, and Rusty. The Russians began hanging out with Josh, and by all accounts, they started behaving quite badly. They were drinking and smoking, and security had to be called. At 1:24 a.m, it's reported that the Russians were actually being quite verbally abusive to the room service operator. Now, security was called again, and the room service operator was advised not to answer the phone if they'd phoned her again. The Russians then went back to the casino, and Jennifer ended up playing poker with one of them, and then Josh and George left for Josh's cabin to drink the absinthe. Later in the evening, George, Jennifer, Josh and the Russians all went together up to the disco. By that point, the casino had closed, and a casino supervisor named Lloyd Botha joined them and apparently was being quite flirty with Jennifer. At around 3:30 a.m, George and Jennifer got into an argument. Witnesses reported hearing him call her a derogatory name, and then she kicked out at him and left alone. Now, a cleaner at this point noticed that she seemed to be in a bad way, and she'd actually smacked her head on the wall. She ended up not being able to find her cabin and passing out in one of the corridors. At this point, George stayed at the disco for 15 more minutes and then went back to his cabin. The Russians and Josh went with him. Now, when they realised that Jennifer wasn't there, they all kind of collectively tried to look for her for a little bit, couldn't find her, and then went back to the cabin. The Russians claimed that they put George to bed and even took his shoes off. Apparently by this point he was completely passed out. They then claimed that they went back to their cabin and ordered room service. Now, Josh claimed that he went to the bathroom while the Russians were putting George to bed. In his statements, it was as if he was making quite a big deal out of this going to the bathroom. Some have argued that he may have been giving himself kind of an alibi as to not having seen what really went on. An ear witness claimed hearing loud yelling coming from the room and arguing between several males. He apparently looked out of the room and saw 3 males leave. However, we know that there was a group of 4, so what happened to the 4th male? The ear witness then interestingly heard what sounded like furniture being dragged about and picked up and dropped. Another ear witness stated it sounded like somebody was throwing things against the wall or against the floor. At about 4:25 a.m, several passengers heard a horrific thud. Security responding to noise complaints tried to get into the cabin but heard nothing, so left. Around a similar time, a plumber found Jennifer passed out in the hallway on deck 9. Members of staff ended up helping her and got her back to her cabin at 4:50 a.m. As you might remember from just a second ago, Josh and the Russians said that they went down to a cabin and supposedly ordered room service. Now, interestingly, they took a picture of their meal and they considered this to be their alibi, but there is potential that the timestamp on the picture could have been faked. There was also no written record of orders written down or delivered from their room. Obviously, we know from the drama earlier that the room service operator was aware that if the men rang again, then they were just to ignore them. So on July the 5th, it became apparent that George was missing, and at 7:30 a.m, passengers woke to a huge blood stain on the metal canopy. Now, frustratingly, apparently the members of staff on the boat actually just wiped this away. It appeared to everyone that George had gone overboard. Police started an investigation and they also found a small amount of blood on George and Jennifer's sheets. The blood ended up being George's. When questioned by police, Josh was very quick to try and implicate Lloyd, who'd been flirting with Jennifer. George's mum also became very suspicious of Jennifer when she refused to talk about what happened that night. However, this may be just a response to obviously very traumatic situation that had gone on, and theories about the case explore the possibility that Jennifer may have been drugged. Very interestingly, 15 years after George was lost at sea, Greg Rosenberg, one of the Russians, was murdered on his doorstep by an unknown perpetrator or perpetrators. Could this have been linked to George's death? Maybe he was involved in some way or saw something he shouldn't have. The case is still currently unsolved, and the Smith family is offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
And then one of the officers, he said to his other officer, she's just too scared. We need to separate her from them. She can't answer with them right there. And then finally, one of the officers said, well, if you're Elizabeth Smart, your family misses you so much. And they love you so much. And they have never given up hope on you the entire 9 months you're gone. Don't you want to go back home to your family? And it was just at that point that I felt like, well, no matter what the consequences are, I don't care. I want to go home.
The detective said, Dad, I want you to stop everything right now and come directly down to Sandy Police Department. I got down to Sandy Police, and an officer said, oh, Mr. Smart, come this way. And I went down this hallway and turned to the right, and I stood there. And I looked at this girl, and I said, Elizabeth, is it you? She said, yes, Dad. And I stood there, crying and crying and crying.
We're here to announce officially that we have found Elizabeth Smart. As he sat there holding me, it was the happiest moment of my life.
I made the decision that I wasn't going to let these two captors win. I wasn't going to let them take my life from me. I would do everything I possibly could to survive.
And I'll never forget the day, 9 months later, we were walking up State Street in Salt Lake City.
Yes, could you tell me, is this like how, if I think I see that Emmanuel they're looking for?
And all of a sudden, there were police cars pulling up around us, and these police officers were jumping out of the car. And this was not the first time that we'd been approached by police officers.
When I got out of my car, I asked them what their names were. They gave me Peter Marshall, Juliet Marshall, and Augustine Marshall.
And they came over and surrounded us and started asking questions. And my two captors, they kept giving answers.
This girl standing off to the side really stood out to me because she had this disguise on. It just didn't fit.
She was wearing a wig, a gray-haired wig. claiming that she was 17 or 18. She was the only one out of 3 wearing some sort of disguise.
Marcy, she immediately clamped her hand down onto my leg, and in my 14-year-old mind, I just knew that if I did anything or said anything, that I would be killed, and then they'd go after my family.
She then said something like, I think you know who I think I am, but I'm not that person.
And the officer started asking me questions, and there had been a whole backstory prepared by my 2 captors that they told me I should say if I was ever questioned. And so I started giving those answers because they were standing right next to me.
So at one point I could see her t-shirt actually moving. Her heart was pounding very fast in her chest. Her eyes welled up with tears. You could tell she wanted just to physically say it.
Today we're going to be talking about lobotomies. A lobotomy is a brain surgery that was initially made as a last resort for mental health patients that didn't respond to other treatments. They weren't initially seen as a cure, but instead as a treatment to help the quality of life of the patients by reducing their symptoms. Lobotomies include severing or damaging the connection between the frontal lobe from other parts of the brain, usually being the thalamus. They were believed to be able to treat a variety of different things, including schizophrenia, depression, aggression, bipolar disorder, intellectual disabilities, homosexuality, criminal insanity, brain tumors, and more. Back when the lobotomy procedure was created to all the way to when it was at its prime, there weren't medications that were used to help alleviate mental disabilities, and psychotherapy was still in its early stages. A very basic summary behind it is that they believed that the frontal lobe was in charge of aggression, hallucinations, and other symptoms, so they would just sever the connection. Later on, the more popular belief came from Walter Freeman. He believed that psychosis came from excessive self-reflection, aka overthinking. And lobotomies were quite literally the way to cut it off at the source. Since the concept was created in the late 19th century, it evolved slightly, giving us 3 different main types of lobotomies that we know today. The first is the tepectomy, which was created by a German psychiatrist named Gottlieb Burckhardt in 1891. He initially began by removing parts of schizophrenic patients' brains and found that it made them quieter. To him, this showed that he helped the patient's quality of life. However, the medical community rejected him, and lobotomies didn't come back until the 1930s. The next style of lobotomy that we're going to cover is the leucotomy. This revision led so that way it didn't have to be open brain surgery. Instead, 2 holes were drilled into the skull and ethyl alcohol was injected into the prefrontal cortex, which disrupted the neuronal tracts. Later, after more testing, this technique was revised again, and instead of using the alcohol, they used an instrument that could cut the connection between the frontal cortex and the thalamus. This technique was created by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Moniz and his colleague Almeida Lima. Once they started this technique, it didn't take long for it to get all around Europe and then the US. And for their technique and their research, they won the Nobel Prize in 1949. The last form of lobotomies we're not really going to cover because it's after everything else we're going to be talking about, but it's called neuroinjection of sclerosing agent, and they actually use this in other parts of the body as well. Now we're going to get back to the leucotomy. Once this technique reached the United States, neurologist Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon James Watts modified the procedure to make it less invasive. For them, it started where they worked together and they used electric shock therapy to make their patient unconscious. Then they would drill a single hole into the patient's skull and sever the connection that we talked about earlier. Then Freeman decided to revise it again, and this time he was able to do it by himself. Beforehand, he would still use the electric shock therapy to make the patients unconscious, and then he used a tool that looked like an ice pick that would go through the eye sockets and pierce the brain. The procedure usually took about 10 minutes, and he believed that with this method it could be done in any condition with little equipment. And I ran out of time, so if you guys want to hear more, let me know.